Hi, everyone. Today, what we're going to do is wrap up the fourth chapter and continue to look at socialization and identity development. So, if you recall, basically what we did in the first part of chapter four is look at socialization and how it impacts the individual in terms of understanding the social world, in terms of understanding him or herself. So through socialization, you learn about the way of things, the ways of the world, but also you learn about who you are not. So again, identity for a symbolic interactionist is not inborn. It's not something that comes from the inside out, but rather identity, who you are, who you're not, is developed from the outside in. The kind of external social forces, the feedback, kind of let you know kind of who you are, who you're not, and you kind of use those meanings to come up with different senses of self. And the same thing can be said with gender identities. Just like, one sense of self, one sense of gender is not inborn, it's not innate, but rather it's learned through the socialization process. And you start to learn gender meanings. And once you internalize those meanings, you can use them to kind of guide yourself as a gendered individual. So now we'll continue to look at socialization and identity by looking at, this process is ongoing. It's very fluid in terms of one's sense of self can change over time. One sense of self can, vary situation to situation. So it's the same thing with one's, worldviews. Just because you have certain beliefs and certain values at one time, doesn't mean as a result, some type of social experience, new socialization, it doesn't mean you're going to maintain those beliefs. You're going to keep the same values. So it's like our senses of self, our understandings of good and bad, right and wrong, all these things can develop over time. And so when looking at identity, we can look at both kind of social and personal. Social is how you kind of see other people, and then personal identity is basically how you see yourself. So looking at what we call status passages, we use these things to self-define, we use these things to define others, but often, these meanings we use they'll go away eventually. They're not always with you. So for example, a lot of people who play athletics, at a high school level, will see themselves as an athlete, or they play athletics at the college level. They'll self-define as the lacrosse player, field hockey player. But then, once the college years are over, once the high school is over, you don't continue to play. You can no longer kind of use that as a meaning to self-define. And the same thing with other people defining you. When you're playing a sport, people see you as that athlete. But when you quit playing, you're now the kind of ex-athlete. So people start to see you based upon, new meanings they can use to define you, and you'll do the same thing for yourself. And so you see this, as a college student, you'll use that to kind of self-define, to self-understand, and other people will define you as a college student as well. But once again, you leave college, you can no longer, use that role to define other people, to define yourself. So, you have to find kind of a new identity. And often, after college, that strong identity marker becomes one's occupation, one's job. So people will use their occupation to self-define, and people will use the occupation to define you as well. And so, worker as a strong kind of definition in terms of kind of what we use to define people. But again, often based upon kind of the status of the job. So usually we're more likely to find people, more likely to find ourselves in terms of our work if the job carries a lot of kind of prestige, a higher status with it, compared to if the job is very kind of low status or neutral status. Typically we won't use that to self-define or to define other people. And a big one that comes is when one becomes a parent. So maybe you're kind of seeing as your job in terms of your social identity, and then perhaps you become a mother. And typically that new role will be used to kind of define you. And it's interesting because there are some gender dynamics going on here. Just because a male, a guy who's working, becomes a father, typically the father role doesn't come to dominate his sense of self. and the social kind of understanding of him. But when a woman becomes a mother, typically that mother role carries kind of higher significance. So they'll be used to define her. They'll be used by women to define themselves as well. So nevertheless, you have these kind of status passages because, you have to kind of enter them. And sometimes, you'll leave them as well. And when you leave the status, you can no longer use it to self-define or to define other people. And so here are, we can call it rites of passages. So these are basically, different activities, rituals, if they're formalized, that carry high symbolic significance. And these rites of passage, they vary over time and place to place and by person. And so it's over time, sometimes, what used to be considered significant in terms of becoming an adult is not the same today. Likewise, when you look at kind of place to place, you have, a lot of different rituals, a lot of different, rites of passages that carry significance. In one culture, perhaps that carries zero significance, but in another culture, it maybe has a lot of significance. And by person. So, for some people, for example, college graduation is a big deal, becoming an adult. For other people, graduating college isn't a big deal at all. It's just something that, they're kind of going through. So, just because, one rite of passage carries significance for one person doesn't mean that the same rite of passage will carry the same amounts of significance for all people. And so just, some examples. The book, mostly talked about, different rites of passages, cross-culturally, just to kind of show how different cultures, we have different kind of ways of defining when one kind of enters adulthood. But I think about, different things. Sometimes when people get their first piercings, that's kind of a sign that you're kind of growing up, becoming more of an individual, more of an adult. When people start shaving for the first time, and that can be seen as another kind of activity that carries kind of some symbolic significance to it. Graduations, and again, so for some people, high school graduation is a big deal. For others, it's not a big deal at all. So it's just, it will vary from person to person. Losing virginity often is kind of seen as passing from kind of a younger person to an adult. Going hunting for the first time, I know that was a big deal where I grew up in central Illinois. When you went hunting for the first time, it's kind of a sign that you're ready to do something, you're responsible. So kind of entering that, adult with a lowercase a, adulthood time period. So again, you can think about, a lot of these things, and they're arbitrary. So there's any type of activity, but we define them as being important, and kind of that definition kind of signifies that you're becoming an adult. You're kind of getting past one's teenage years, childhood years. And so the end of the chapter gets at kind of these larger turning points where, it has this kind of almost kind of overnight, it's very quick kind of shift in one's sense of self. Epiphanies, they can call them, but basically these kind of major turning points where something happens to a person and they begin to kind of self-define very differently compared to before the event happened. And the same thing can be said in terms of social identity. Typically, when these things happen to you, other people will start to see you differently, like you start to see yourself differently. And so, it can change not only your sense of self, but it can change kind of your worldviews, your thoughts, your feelings. So again, these are kind of heavy symbolic events that carry so much meaning that can really kind of shift one sense of self, one sense of the world. So just some examples here. The medical diagnosis, the chapter talked about an individual with a HIV and how that's a dramatic shift, once you kind of find out that you have HIV, and but other types of medical diagnosis, excuse me, carry the same thing. If you get cancer or anything that's kind of major in terms of perhaps it can significantly shorten your life or change your life in one way or another, those things typically, act as these turning points where you start to understand yourself differently and understand the world differently. uh, being going through a criminal assault. So basically, something happens to you that can really change the way you see yourself. Um, so in a sexual assault, definitely that can change one's sense of self, change one's kind of feeling and thoughts of the world. A loss of a partner, a loss of a job. So if you go from being married to a widow, a widower, those things, studies show kind of drastically kind of change one's sense of self, one's kind of understanding of the world. Job loss can definitely do this as well. And a lot of studies on kind of job loss as major turning points show there's a gender dynamic to that as well, where men typically take, losing a job much more personally compared to women. And so, again, all this, like we've been saying, is kind of fluid. It'll kind of, people will go through the experiences differently. But nevertheless, when you kind of go through these major turning points, typically it does kind of have that paradigm shift in terms of there's a sea change going on in terms of your sense of self, your understanding of the world. And so we can also recognize how, the labels you attach to these moments, the phrasing you use, can also influence, people's kind of understandings. So, people today are more likely to talk about that you're living with cancer rather than dying from cancer, living with HIV rather than dying from. So again, just the phrasing of it can get you to kind of think and kind of see things a little differently. The same thing about somebody going through a criminal assault experience. So in the past it was always the victim, the victim, the victim, and now today we say more often, the survivor. So again, depending on the label you use, the meanings attached to the label, you kind of see the situation different, and it's much more kind of positive light when you say living with, or when you say survivor, rather than saying dying with, or being a victim of something. The same thing, if you're out of work, if you say you're unemployed, that may carry some type of social stigma. But if you say I'm kind of in the market, so I'm looking for work, it's the same situation. Your unemployment status has not changed, but nevertheless, you kind of say I'm in the market, I'm actively looking. It doesn't carry as much stigma if you just say that I don't have a job, I'm unemployed. So, this chapter basically lays out this idea of socialization being important in kind of learning the ways of the world, but also recognizing how the socialization process strongly influences one's identity, and strongly influences how we see other people as well. And all those meanings are very fluid in terms of they can change quickly, they can change with time, but nevertheless, the constant of identity is change, because things will always kind of change in terms of social and personal identities. So I'm going to leave that there for today. We'll continue to kind of look at the idea of identity when we get into the next couple readings. Again, I'll be splitting the next chapter up into two different parts. We'll be looking at the self. So kind of staying on the same topic, but again, kind of working our way from the bottom up as they're doing throughout the textbook.